Okay, so the politics of statehood. Basically where we got down on this one was to the Know-Nothing Party. Because you kind of have the Republicans and the Democrats here. Then in the mid-1850s, like just a sweep of popular opinion brings in a group known as the Know-Nothings. These guys were anti-foreigners, they were very nativist, they were anti-Catholic, they were against a lot of things. The reason why they were called the Know-Nothings is because they were kind of like a secret political party. You had reporters that would be outside their political meetings, and they'd ask them, "What y'all talk about in there?" And they all said, "Oh, we don't know anything. We don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, a know nothing, eh?" And they probably had their biggest effect in the elections of 56. But after that, they kind of disintegrated because they couldn't keep things together, like the Whigs that are going through the same thing at the same time. Well, guys, you can't get away from slavery when you're talking about politics of the 1850s. Remember, Congress even refused to talk about slavery. They had a gag rule from 1836 to about the end of the Mexican War. But now with the end of the Mexican War, all this new land added to America, you couldn't help but talk about slavery and what was going to be done about it. One of the characters that was curious in this was Sam Houston, who antagonized pro-slavery leaders in 1848 by voting for the creation of the Free Soil Territory of Oregon and refusing to sign South Carolina's John C. Calhoun's pro-slavery protest against what Calhoun termed as the aggression of the free states. In his speeches and debates on the controversy leading up to the Compromise of 1850, he was pretty much anti-slavery, and indeed, because he wasn't really sure if he could succeed himself as governor here in Texas, and he ran as a Jackson Democrat or a Unionist, which is kind of like their version of the Independent Party. And guys, Sam Houston is the only guy in the history of the United States of America that was governor of 2 different states, that was president of a foreign country, that was a U.S. Senator 4 times. So, pretty cool. All right, immigration and the extension of settlement. Now guys, as always, the biggest thing about Texas was its cheap land. That was about the only way we could make it happen. During 1845, newspapers in Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana abounded with the news of settlers departing for Texas. By 1848, in December of 1848, 300 immigrants crossed the ferry at Washington on the Brazos. And during November of 1849, more than 5,000 were on their way. I mean, basically we were being flooded. The census of 1850 showed 154,034 whites with 58,161 slaves and 397 free blacks. By 1860, the population had exploded up to 604,215. But sadly, so had slavery, because of this number, 182,621 were free slaves. About 3/4 of the immigrants that were coming in came from the Old South. But the largest population increase, the second largest increase, was actually foreign-born Germans, as well as settlers that were coming in from Mexico. Basically, the settlers from Mexico settled in the Rio Grande Valley. And by the way, the Germans were settling up in the hill country. Indeed, for a time, German was the second most spoken language in Texas, exceeding Spanish. The growth of slavery. Well, the population of slaves in Antebellum, Texas increased at a rate even higher than that of the free population, estimated at 5,000 in 1836. By 1850, it's 182,566. By the census of 1850, 30% of the people in Texas owned a slave. Now remember, the vast majority owned 5 or less, and the vast majority of those that owned 5 or less only owned 1. And by 1860, that number had actually declined down to 62,000. Well, who's holding the slaves then? The guys who are holding the majority of the slaves are the plantation owners. And they produce 90% of the cotton crop. Once again, why was slavery needed for cotton or tobacco? Any of those cash crops?
There was such a high demand for it.
Well, not only is there a high demand, but you had to have labor because you had to process that crop after you picked it. Especially here in Texas, where we had the short staple cotton that has a high seed to fiber ratio. You had to run it through a cotton gin to separate those seeds from the fiber. And a cotton gin could do, one man in 1 hour could do the work of 10 slaves, I believe, or 10 men. So it was incredibly labor intensive. All right, exploration. At the close of the Mexican War, Texas was basically a line through Denton, Dallas, Waco, Austin, Fredericksburg, San Antonio, Castroville, and Laredo. Everything west of that was wild country. Now we needed, because Texas is such a huge state, Texans working with the U.S. Army of Engineers had to find practical routes through central Texas and El Paso. This is where you have the assistance of Texas Ranger like Captain Coffee Jack Hayes or John C. Hayes. His nickname was Coffee because apparently he liked to transport the bodies either of his comrades or for those that he had meted out justice to. He would surround them with coffee grounds to help prevent the decay. John S. Rip Ford. once again, because Texas is so huge, the Secretary of War for the United States, Jefferson Davis, came out with a novel idea for us to get things across West Texas. Basically, he brought about 50 camels to Texas. And then they realized that camels, A, they don't like horses, B, they don't like people, C, they're tough son of a guns to train. We had no idea what we were doing. So after about 2 years of messing with the Camel Corps, they just let them free. And one of its stops was actually New Braunfels. All right, the Indian frontier. Guys, basically, especially the Comanches being the biggest threat and nuisance, the Indian War here in Texas would rage for about 30 years. Now, the U.S. tried to pacify this with building a line of 8 military forts from Fort Duncan all the way up to Fort Worth. Then that would help pacify the countryside. Indeed, that one Texas Ranger I told you about, Rip Ford, there was a time when he was out surveying near Enchanted Rock, and a band of about 21 Comanche started coming after him. Well, he can see from Enchanted Rock because he's up higher. He had experimental guns with him, the Colt 6 shooters. And so basically he used those, which shocked the Indians that believed he had a bullet for each finger on his hand. And he was able to defend himself and escape. So the U.S. government goes through this huge expense building these 8 military forts. But guys, by 2 years, settlement has already passed them up. Because people are flooding here. Causing them to build another line of forts. Yeah, in 1851, there's another 7 forts that are built. Then they come up with the idea of, hey, let's try to build a reservation system for the Native Americans. They gave them some good land in East Texas. Others got good land near the mouth of rivers. And for the most part, it did pacify the Native Americans. By 1856, the 2nd Cavalry of the U.S. Army is here with leaders like Albert Sidney Johnston, later Confederate General, Robert E. Lee, later Confederate General, and John D. Hood, later Confederate General. To set up defenses against the Native Americans. Who, by the way, the Comanches, remember, they were carrying out raids all the way up here in America, all the way down into Mexico. Los Comancheros. And after the Native Americans that lived on the reservation became pacified, while nearby whites didn't like the fact that they had this good land. And they wanted that land. So you start having the removal of the reservations. Indeed, in the modern day, Texas only has 4 reservations for Native Americans. And only on one of them are they trying to do gambling. The Kickapoos near the Rio Grande River. Oh, ready? then Houston gets elected, and Houston is even more serious about it, except he doesn't like the fact that we're having to depend on the Army of the United States. So he raises up 7 new companies of Texas Rangers. That are very effective in pacifying the area. Then in 1859, we have Juan Cortina, who was kind of like a Robin Hood. Now his Mexican family was very rich. They had land in the Rio Grande Valley, even though he was born down in Tamaulipas. All right, he comes up here. His family's land was near modern-day Brownsville. Well, it was Brownsville back then. And he really got kind of ticked off at what he believed, and what was, basically a cadre of judges and other officials that basically were ripping off native-born Tejanos of their land in defiance of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Well, one day he sees a deputy beat the tar out of somebody who used to work for his family. So guess what Juan does? He kills him. Well, then the next day, the sheriff and a group of about 40 go against Juan and his group of ranchers. And guess what Juan does? He kills the sheriff. And then he's able to escape down into Mexico. Well, they even send some Texas Rangers down here that aren't able to catch him. They do, however, chase him to the other side of the Rio Grande River. And he kind of goes into the interior. He stays there for a little while until he comes back in the 1870s. And that's kind of at a standoff there. Goes back down into Mexico. We go to Mexico. We complain to Mexico City that he needs to be returned to Texas for justice. And he's not sent back up here, and he dies a free man in the 1880s. But to a lot of the Tejanos that lived in the Rio Grande Valley at the time, he was seen as a hero. We read. Oh. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, that last lecture was kind of a lot of the political things that are going on in Texas during our early statehood. This chapter is kind of going to cover that too, but it's going to look a lot more into the social aspects of how society is developing. Clothes, man. We need help. My lovely little... You're falling apart. Okay. Antebellum, Texas. Alright, by 1861, when the scourge of the Civil War is dividing the nation, the patterns of Texas civilization have been formed, and the state's cultural institutions have been established. In a lot of ways, they reflected the Old South, because the majority of the people that were coming here were from the states of the Old South. that in the 1860s, foreigners counted for more than a third of the free population in 5 of the 6 largest towns? Europeans, Mexicans, and African Americans all made huge contributions. Once again, the German immigrants, like we've already talked about, in places like Fredericksburg, in the hill country, both farmed and ranched. Some of the German Americans were known for their achievements in science, medicine, and the arts. They were the first largest immigrant group. The second largest immigrant group were from Mexico. Their numbers concentrated in South Texas and along the Rio Grande Valley. Most lived in farms or ranches. You did have some exceptional Tejanos, such as Santos Benavides, who was a mayor in Laredo, a general in the Civil War, and also a Texas Ranger. You had Jose Navarro, a hero of the Revolution, who participated in writing the Constitution of 1845, and thereafter served in the Texas legislature. Now, you did have African Americans that lived here in Texas. In 1850, there were 397 free blacks in Texas. By 1860, their numbers had actually decreased to 355. Why? Because Texas, both as a republic, then later as a free state, began to pass laws like if you were a free black, you could only live here for 2 years before you had to move out, unless you got special exception from the legislature. People that were affected by this were like William Goyens, a guy who was incredibly skilled in negotiating and set up peace with the Cherokee tribe, so we weren't attacked during our revolution, as well as 2 other Native American tribes. He petitioned to the government, and he received it, but he was one of the lucky ones. Occupation. Well, you did start to have some merchants that were moving to Texas. Like by 1860, we had 2,223. If you look like the town of Marshall, we had more than enough lawyers. We had a few doctors. But for the whole state of Texas, let me see if I can find it. But for the whole state of Texas, there were only 65 dentists. You had manufacturing and the crafts also there. Even though they were slow, like you had to manufacture wagons, carriages, and other vehicles. You had one factory in Houston that produced professional textiles. But guys, by far and large, the biggest occupation most people had was farming. We were farmers. And of course, the most profitable crop was cotton. Even though you did have people grow food crops, perhaps the most popular crop after cotton was like corn, wheat. Slavery in the plantation system. All right, plantation quarters. Guys, plantation owners, usually their houses would be either 1 or 2 room affair. They tried to crowd not more than a family. So about 6 people. 8 would be the max. But they would not put more than 8. They got 2 suits for the winter and 2 suits for the spring. Basically by suits, I mean, you wouldn't get like a dress suit, you'd get a shirt and pants. Or a blouse and a dress. And basically 1 set would be work clothes, 1 set would be your church clothes. Now, why do you think in the north, where we have free wage labor going on during this time, they are cramming people deep into housing? Why do they only have like 6 to 8 people in the house? Well, how many people here grew up in a house with a family? You have brothers and sisters? What happens? Usually this happens to the young ones, to the younglings. Youngling gets cold. What soon happens to everybody in the family? They catch that cold, especially the other siblings. Guys, they were doing that because they didn't want to reduce down their workforce. Also, the slaves had a much more varied diet than did their compatriots in the north. Work was grueling and unending. It was hard, monotonous, drudgery. In some places there would be a church for them to go to on Sundays. In most places they would congregate outside for worship. Laws were passed that guaranteed the right to own slaves, protected the ownership of slaves kind of as a property right. They prohibited the stealing of slaves, enticing the slaves to run away, inciting rebellion. They also passed a law saying trading of slaves was illegal. Even though that was oftentimes overlooked. Basically, citizens were charged with the responsibility of returning runaway slaves to their masters, and were in some instances entitled to rewards. But in the rest of the U.S., where would the slaves try to go to seek their freedom? Like if you were in Ohio, where would you try to go? Oh, wait a minute, no, slaves weren't in Ohio. Missouri. If you're in Missouri, where would you try to get to? Huh? Yeah, Ohio, we're a free state right above you. Okay? Here in Texas, we are so far away from everybody else. About 4,000 slaves ran away to Mexico and started their own community. Indeed, Dr. Torget, the guy who was in my Gonzales documentary, he did a lot of groundbreaking research on the black runaway slave communities down in Mexico. Well, of course, Texas, especially by another guy who was one of my professors, Professor Campbell, he called Texas an empire for slavery. And you had a lot of people in Texas that really wanted to reopen the slave trade. The slave trade in the U.S., the international slave trade, was made illegal in 1820. But, especially the plantation owners, they really wanted the reopening of the international slave trade. And not so much by the 1850s, but I know like back in 1836, oh goodness, what was his name? Had pneumonia at the Alamo. James Bowie. Y'all know James Bowie? James Bowie traded in illegal contraband, internationally slave trades. He basically worked with someone in the U.S. who hit them in the bayous of Louisiana. He crossed them over down here into Texas for sale. Now, of course, as Texas is becoming more and more cosmopolitan, you also had urban slavery, where, like if one of the guys that I wrote something that's in the Texas Historical Association's Handbook of Texas, he had a butler. He was a lawyer, and he had a butler that was a slave. I wrote another deal. Now, this is a really sad story. I wrote this deal on this one guy. I'll get his name for you later. But he had enough money. In 1850, he owned 2 slaves. And they were both little kids. Because basically the deal is you buy a slave when they were young, keep them for a few years, and then you want to turn around and sell them again. Well, by the 1860 survey, he has 3 slaves. And one of the slaves is the same. Well, 2 of the slaves are the same. Well, then we have the Civil War. Civil War breaks out, after the Civil War, he frees his slaves, but he adopts his youngest male slave. Even names that slave after himself, Little Joe. Well, he goes and they start he gets out a mule deal with the Army where they basically raise mules, sell them to the U.S. Army. That lasts until about 1877. He gets tired of it and he splits California. In California, he's there he starts the very first Methodist church in what is now a suburb of LA. And during that year, his son dies, Little Joe. So he wants Little Joe to be buried next to the plot that has his wife and him. And his church absolutely refuses it. So he quits the church that he started out there. Years go by, he went to another church. He was within the same denomination. He's buried with his wife, and his son was buried in the African American cemetery. Okay, now that is where my editor wanted me to stop the story, and guys, that is where the story stopped, which sucks, because what happened in 1968, people said, this ain't right, he needs to be buried with his parents. They exhumed little Joe, and they buried him back with his parents. So the family's reunited. But my editor, for whatever reason, didn't want me to stop that thing on the end. He wanted to keep it where they're separated. Oh. Life on the farms. Alright guys, most of the people that lived on the farms, the style of house they lived in was called a dog-run cabin. That's where you had a cabin on one side that had the kitchen, stove, and everything like that. Usually there'd be a covered roof. All this is porch down here. Then there'd be sleeping quarters over here. It would allow the breeze to blow in between the two. You wouldn't have the oven heating up the house, and if the oven and everything burnt down, you'd hopefully be able to save the other thing. And of course they'd say in the middle, trying to catch the wind, to entertain guests, to eat. In South Texas, the Tejanos would live in jacals made out of adobe. And in the hill country, the Germans actually used a lot of native stone in building what they called fachwerk. That's a fun word, fachwerk. Now, who had the hardest work of all in the frontier homes? Guys, it was the frontier women. They are responsible for all the washing, they were responsible for all the food preparation, they were responsible for making sure there was enough firewood, they were responsible for taking care of the sick, they were responsible for getting children dressed, they were responsible for educating the children. Tough, tough, tough work. Indeed, have any of you guys ever seen, the BBC used to do a series, one was called Victorian Homes, where they took a bunch of people and they tried to make them live like they lived in Victorian times. And they had to obey all the rules, wear the clothes. The women were like, no, they rebelled. And basically they said, we're not doing it. That's an interesting show. Ready for the next slide. The towns. Galveston was the largest town in Texas, followed by San Antonio, Houston, New Braunfels, and Marshall. Why was Marshall so big? Well, it basically did a lot of lumber. And there was something in the Red River at that time known as the Great Raft, which basically was a backlog of all these trees that had fallen down, kind of creating a natural reservoir that made maritime traffic much more profitable and easier. By the 1890s, though, they destroyed that raft. And that just like crashed the towns of both Paris as well as Marshall. The city's public buildings, there wasn't much, but hotels were seen as the shining establishments of civilization. In San Antonio, and it's still open and operating today, you have the Menger Hotel. Has anybody here been to San Antonio? Seen the Menger? Did you see the Menger?
No, I didn't see it.
Oh yeah. Okay. First off, there are two two cool little factoids about the Menger Hotel. Basically, the Menger is where Teddy Roosevelt recruited the Rough Riders. Most of the guys from Texas that were in the Rough Riders joined him at the Menger. Also, how many of y'all like going on those ghost tours? Have y'all ever heard of ghost tours? We're like, haunted Dallas, haunted St. Antonio. Well, there's like two places in the Menger that are supposedly haunted. One by a girl that committed suicide. So, if you like the haunted tours, you'll definitely stop at the Menger down in San Antonio. Now, one of the things that really retarded or slowed down the development of towns was that we didn't have a lot of money. Not a lot of people carried a lot of cash. Once again, we're made basically a barter economy. And we didn't have a lot of banking services. Indeed, there were laws passed, both in the Republic period and in our early statehood, that severely limited banks. Because banks were seen as the enemy of the common man. Now guys, why do we need banks? Why is it a good idea? Why were y'all remember when the Great Recession first started? When Bush, his presidency was ending and Obama was coming in? I mean, were y'all even born then? Yeah, but guys, first you have people getting thrown out of their homes, all this stuff. Yet who does the government save? It saves the banks. Why?
Banks loan out the money.
Banks loan out the money. Because he has a great idea. And his idea, sure, he's going to start small with about maybe 12 people, but if he keeps working this thing, so he'll hire 35, then we'll go up to 50, and his company's going to need your company, and your company, and your company, so all of you survive. But you need to loan them the money. Of course, what was the one bad thing that happened after the scare? We save out the banks, and then did the banks loan out the money? No. They got hit hard. And so we're not so sure about you. Guys, that's why do you think Plano bent over backwards for Toyota?
Created a lot of jobs.
Created tons of jobs. But I mean, they got a sweet deal. They got all that land for free. The state of Texas and Plano promised to build access to their headquarters. They got a rail line out to their headquarters. Not having to pay taxes for 7 years. They'll have to pay eventually. But the deal is, Toyota doesn't pay taxes. You who work at Toyota, you do. You're a grocery store owner. Well, now you have more customers, so you're going to have to hire more people because you're going to be selling more. Same thing with you in your clothing store. She's an apartment holder, or maybe she owned a house. Guys, the year after Toyota showed up in Plano, the value of houses in Plano increased 20%. And even as far away as like TI, you know where TI is near 635 and 75? Home prices over there increased about 15%. Not as much, but it's like a shockwave. And guys, because we limited and restricted our banking services, you didn't have the places that held capital that made investment possible. All right, uno mas, and then I shall release you to the wild. Transportation. Well, guys, we're in the early days of everything. I mean, railroad construction in the 1850s, it is like the only railroad construction that's going on in the 1850s, Houston, Galveston area. Now, why was it so limited? Because, guys, it is so expensive. Even though it may have been the best. During this time, the easiest and least expensive way to transport things were basically coastal outlets Like Galveston and lower down you had Matagorda Bay. Just like under Stephen F. Austin, riverine traffic was incredibly important, you know, taking crops down to Brazos, Colorado. The Trinity, much more tricky, much more tempestuous. But that proved chief. Why? Because guys, even look here, our chief roads, like the old military road. Oh, by the way, do you know what we call the old military road today? Preston Road. It went all the way up to the Red River. It was described as little better than a cow track. So we got it? All right, remember guys, your thought questions are going to be due on Friday. The other class, y'all will be due on Wednesday.